All right, thank you again, everyone, for joining JMT Consulting for our expert speaker series today. My name is Megan Mendiola, and I'm a regional marketing coordinator here at JMT. We're very happy to have John Dartley with us here today. He's going to give us lots of good nonprofit legal and practical advice in light of this COVID-19 pandemic. This webinar is sponsored by JMT Consulting. We are an ERP and financial management solutions consulting firm with 28 years of experience specializing in nonprofits. We work with a wide variety of software partners to find the best solution for your nonprofit. I'd like to share with everyone just a few housekeeping notes before I turn it over to John to get us started. If you do have any questions during the webinar today, please go ahead and submit those into the question and answer portion on your control panel. We're going to read as many of those out to John as we can throughout the course of today's webinar. And today's webinar recording and slides will also be emailed to you within 24 hours following the conclusion of today's webinar. Finally, I would like to introduce John Dartley to everyone today. John founded and operated Involve Inc., the web application development and design firm that pioneered online peer-to-peer fundraising, list building, and advocacy campaigns for nonprofits. So Involve was acquired by Cantera Inc., a leading cloud software partner to nonprofits. When Blackbaud acquired Cantera, John was named Senior Deputy General Counsel and Information Governance Chair. In addition, John has more than 15 years of experience representing nonprofit organizations in a wide variety of business matters and legal transactions. He has extensive knowledge in matters related to privacy and big data, technology, outsourcing, software, intellectual property and licensing, internet-related transactions, general corporate matters, and venture-related funding. And with that, John, I won't take up any more of your time, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to get us started.
Thanks so much, and welcome everybody. Again, I'm an attorney. I work with for Perlman and Perlman. Just quick background on Perlman and Perlman. Also been practicing for over 40 years. We specialize in working with nonprofits. We have over 1,500 clients, and we like to say we're generalists in a specialized area of nonprofit law. And with that, let's get to the work we're going to do today. So we're going to cover a lot, but if there are questions as we move through these things, please submit them and we'll try to kind of answer in real time. So as we all know, unfortunately, COVID-19 outbreak has been declared a pandemic. World Health Organization, no surprise anymore. Thomas Kuhn is a philosopher and a physicist, and he had this notion of a paradigm shift. And a paradigm shift really only occurs, once every, 50 to 200 years. You typically don't know when it happens until after it's happened. It's kind of like a recession. You have to kind of look back. But the notion of a paradigm shift is when the reference to your world changes. There's a fundamental change in the basic concepts of how we kind of view the world and kind of walk through the world. And I think at least in the short term, COVID has forced the world to kind of rethink how they live and how they work. How long this persists, we'll see. But certainly this has the potential to be considered kind of a paradigm shift. And with that shift comes certain challenges and challenges to kind of rethink the way we do things. Okay, next slide, please. So obviously business is not as usual. Some organizations have what I call a business continuity plan. Yours may not, most don't, most at least nonprofits don't, they should. And this is kind of a good wake-up call. But even for those organizations that had a business continuity plan, pandemics are kind of pose a unique challenge. It's not a localized incident like a power outage. There's rapid acceleration. The duration is kind of unknown. There's just a lot of impact that's kind of hard to plan for. So traditional business continuity plans often make assumptions about short-term outages, but they don't really plan for things like a pandemic. So hopefully a lot of the advice we'll be talking about today is things you can put in place if you haven't already to kind of better move through this new world. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about dealing with these types of things like pandemics, technology now is a really key concern. And some of the questions you need to ask, and you may have asked these already, is can your technology and infrastructure support the new way people are working remotely? There's increased traffic on the network. There could be bandwidth issues. Have you performed a stress test on the system? You probably haven't, but the last few weeks, probably did one for you anyway, and if things are working well, that's great. And also what tools, you might want to ask, what tools will your company need going forward? Should people need to kind of continue to work from home on a kind of staggered basis? What things will help make that more fluid? But as we talk about people kind of moving to the home office and working more from home or public spaces, we have to really talk about cyber risk. So here's some issues to consider just for, when you're working for the remote workforce. And let's first kind of just put a context in. You can go to the next slide. First of all, why is protecting data important? We call it PII. It's called personally identifiable information. And as you all know, this type of data is a very valuable organization asset. This data is at higher risk of theft or misuse than ever before. First of all, small and mid-sized nonprofits have always been at a higher risk than for-profit and larger companies, simply because they don't have the type of infrastructure in place or processing in place to kind of protect this data. And loss of data can have long-term consequences. Reputational harm and loss of donor trust are really key. And there was a study a few years ago that showed that the impact on a nonprofit organization as compared to a for-profit when there's a data breach or unauthorized access is much greater. So for example, many of us might have been affected by the Facebook breach a couple of years ago, but probably few of us shut down our accounts and never went back, right? Unfortunately, nonprofits are seen to be as a little more fungible. So when a nonprofit has a data loss or a data breach, they find that many donors the following year decided to donate to a different organization or maybe another organization that they had been donating to in the past, as opposed to going back. So I think it's even more critical for nonprofits to be kind of thinking about cybersecurity and best practices. There are also obviously financial penalties and costs and legal liability. And I should say, every year, the amount of data breaches go up. In 2019, there was a 17% increase over 2018. And the average cost per record that your organization loses is $150 per record. So if you think about how many donors you have, that adds up. There are other costs associated with that as well. So it's important to be thinking about this. And now the last couple months with COVID, I can tell you there's been a marked increase. I was talking to some colleagues who are on the cybersecurity side in terms of the phishing schemes. Myself, every week, I get at least one email from CVS, Amazon, and JP Morgan Chase that is offering me free gift cards. I have to kind of click on a link, and it says chase.com, cvs.com. If you kind of click and look at a subdomain, it has nothing to do with Chase or CVS. But the point is, as people work from home, hackers are aware of that, and the amount of schemes are really going up, and so are the hacks. Okay. Next slide. So before we talk about like practical things to kind of avoid and things to do, let's talk about some of the things you should be doing all the time. If you haven't done them yet, it's a fine time to do them. First is review. Review your current information security and policy. If you don't have one, think about drafting one, and make sure it actually speaks to how people are supposed to work remotely and remotely access company files and digital information. If you don't have anything in place, now's a good time, instead of reviewing it, draft one. Communicate. Managers should be familiar with all the security guidelines, plans, and policies that people should be following. You can't really over-communicate with these types of things. So if you haven't communicated, put a communication out, the expectations, do's and don'ts. And if you have, maybe once a month you remind people. And prepare. So you should prepare in case there's a data breach. This has nothing to do with COVID-19, although it becomes more paramount as it may become more likely. But in general, you should have a data incident response plan. Basically, this is a plan that I help clients write up, you work with your IT folks as well, that should something happen, what are the steps you take to mitigate and inform. Next slide. Remind, and this is, we talked about communication before, the last slide is remind employees of the types of information that they need to safeguard. This also includes information that's confidential organizational information, IP information, but more importantly, donor and employee information. Remind them that these things are different than just kind of what we call things that everybody knows about the company, right? These are protected information and how they're supposed to protect it. Certainly if your organization collects what we call sensitive information, health records, social security numbers, even a higher standard of protection to remind them that these things really need to be treated carefully. And limits a really good way to kind of minimize your risk. Limit employee access to only those who need to have access to that information. If you have PII, personally identifiable information, or sensitive information, really there's probably very few people in the organization that should have access to it. And then train. Listen, training is something I think annually you should do. Most of the training is now done online, so it's not too late. But at least once a year, train employees, again, what I call the do's and don'ts, kind of the smart practices. I see with so many clients helping them work through data breaches that at least half of them could have been avoided with kind of, smarter or more commercially reasonable practices. So definitely in training is an important component here. Okay.
Great, John, we did have a question come in. Someone asks, do you have simple templates or samples of these cyber policies?
What I do have is a template, that checklist for a variety of things we're going to talk about today that kind of shows you your readiness. And I could share that maybe with you, and you can disperse that, or people can email me directly, and I can share that. In terms of the cyber policies, it depends on the organization. So for example, I'll talk about this later, BYOD, do you allow people to bring your own device? We talk about privacy policies. Everything needs to be kind of customized. So while there's not a specific policy, I can give you definitely, if you have my email, you can email me. I can give you a variety of tools that will kind of help you assess what you have and what you don't have. And then, work with your counsel, or happy to work with you as well, to kind of craft something that works for your organization.
Great, and John will share that checklist with us, so we will send that out. And in addition to the recording and the slides for today, we'll send that checklist out as well. Thank you, John. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide.
Great. So let's talk about really practical things, what can go wrong and what we can kind of do to kind of mitigate or minimize. So unsecure both personal and public Wi-Fi networks. We can probably take public Wi-Fi off the table just for the short term. For most of us, we're in shelter in space and we're not, going to our local Starbucks. But we may hopefully soon, so this still applies. But home networks and the use of a public network may be very vulnerable to malware, ransomware, and other attacks through the router, what you're basically accessing the internet through. Most Wi-Fi networks that people access from home are not as robust as the ones we have at work. Many people don't turn on their password. So, when someone comes to my house, they have to ask me for my password to get onto my router. That's often not the case. So tell your employees when they're working from home, advise them to turn on their router firewall and their operating system firewall. And if they should have on their PCs that they're working, the Macs, any malware, antivirus tools. They don't know how to kind of set up their password. They can call whoever they're getting their internet through, cable provider, they can call them and they'll help them walk them through how to set up a password protected home office. Next one, working on unsecure personal devices. Home computers may be shared among family members. They may be left out. They may be taken in a car. They often lack the critical security patch managements that work computers will have. So if your employees are working not from a computer you provided them, make sure first if they do have employer provided computers, really make sure they're doing all their work on that. If not, they should only use your personal laptops themselves. They should not bring them out of the house, and try to minimize the type of information they download to that computer. Transferring corporate data, organizational data, using personal email accounts. A lot of us kind of got thrown into this work from home quickly. What a lot of people have done in the past, and maybe continue to do it, is you transfer data from your company to yourself via your email address. Advise employees not to do that. Personal email accounts are not as safe as corporate email accounts. If they have done that, have them remember to delete that information as soon as they're done with it. So what a lot of people do is they send themselves emails, they access the information, and they never delete that email. And that email, if it ever gets hacked, even 5 years from now, is subject to loss. So again, delete if you have to. If you have to take things to your personal email account. Syncing with a personal cloud storage account. Again, there are a number of them out there. Some are more secure than others. If your employees are doing that, have your IT assess which ones are most secure, and then either pay for that on behalf of your employees, or recommend certain providers to use. And physical document and management and destruction. So these days we're always talking about digital electronic data, digital data, and we kind of forget the fact that there are physical documents out there. Folks working from home may have printed out things to bring in home files. They may have taken files from the office. They may be printing things out on their computer to work with them. The loss of physical data and physical documents happens all the time. Employees are doing that. Just advise them how to kind of delete things more permanently. So destruction would be through a shredder. Don't throw things to your garbage can. Don't put things out in the trash. If there any information with personal PII or sensitive information needs to be shredded and again, locked in a cabinet, not left out on the desk where other people can see it. So unsecure and exchange employee systems, we talked about this before a little bit in terms of using, an unprotected Wi-Fi to connect to the office. Ideally, your organization have what they call VPN, a virtual private network. If you have one, great, make sure employees are using it. If not, then make sure that the employee systems at home, again, using the firewalls, using malware, antivirus tools, taking the precautions they should do if they're accessing not through a VPN. Unsecure conference call lines. This is right ironic, we're all on one. This one's secure, but there are a number of providers out there. Look at if your organization is using one, look at the privacy policy. Sometimes these companies reserve the right to tape to see what people are calling in from. So you just need to be, just make sure who you're working with. And again, key vendor relationships. And we're going to touch on this in a couple minutes, but the majority of breaches that happen to organizations happen through third-party vendors. So both at this time when we need to rely on these vendors, we want to make sure that the ones who are providing mission-critical services are providing in a smart way. You want to make sure they have enough bandwidth. If you haven't looked at your agreement and contacted them, make sure they have in place what they need to have in place for you to do your work. Look at the contract, and then going forward, we'll talk about some kind of best tips for now working with these vendors in the future to ensure that your organization is protected. And I talked about in the beginning a little bit kind of the privacy overview of why protecting this data is important. And then we talked about kind of things that can go wrong, having working from home certainly is a challenge from a cybersecurity perspective. And I try to remind clients that even in these troubled times, regulatory compliance, legal compliance has not gone away. To give you one example, some of you may have heard of the New York Shield Act. It actually went into effect March 21st of this year, so not too long ago. This applies to both nonprofits and for-profits, and it applies to anybody collecting any information from anybody residing in New York State. So, basically, if you have a website and you're looking for donors, this will likely apply to you. This does a variety of things, but perhaps the most important kind of bar is that it forces organizations to have a commercially reasonable approach to privacy and cybersecurity. We can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, nonprofits must comply. Your location, your size, doesn't matter. You're collecting information from New York residents, it applies to you. It expands data security and breach notification requirements. Hopefully it doesn't come to that. We don't have to worry about that point. But it does require any organization that owns or licenses computerized data or collects digital data from a New York resident to develop, implement, and maintain reasonable safeguards to protect the security, confidentiality, and integrity of the information, not including disposal of the data. So everything we just spoke about the home office, this applies to, and there's still a high bar. So you need to make sure you're communicating in kind of a prudent way to your employees. Next slide. So let's talk about kind of, like I say, the nuts and bolts. What do you need to do to comply to your Shield Act? Now, I'm assuming that almost everyone listening this applies to, and even if it doesn't, I would say this is kind of a good practice to make you better stewards of the information you collect on behalf of your donors. A couple of years ago, I said the same thing about GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation came out of the European Union. It applies to nonprofits as well. Probably for most, it didn't apply to as much because they had very few people accessing the websites in the EU. New York Shield Act, obviously New York State is much broader implication. But I said the same thing about GDPR as I say about New York Shield Act. Even if it does not apply to you, adopting these processes and procedures will really minimize or lower your risk of having a data loss. And it probably does apply to your organization, so let's avoid the penalties and comply. So one of the things you need to do is designate an employee or employees to coordinate your data security program. There's an old saying, if you don't know where you're going, all roads will take you there. Similar, if you don't have one person in charge of privacy, it's, nothing's really happening. So think about it as somebody internal. If there's an IT person you work with, you can lean on them for part of this. I've helped some of our clients comply with this by being their point person. And so some of the things this requires of an organization, again, have somebody thinking about these issues, train and manage employees in security programs. We talked about this, so annually, just as a smart thing, let's do some training. Assess internal and external risks and implement controls to reduce the risks. So what this really it mandates is you think about what the risks your organization is facing, and you take commercially reasonable steps to kind of mitigate those. And we talk about working from the home office, all those tips I gave you, if you follow those, you're probably satisfying this requirement should there be a breach, and the Attorney General looks into what happened. Vetting service providers, I mentioned that service providers is probably the biggest cause for nonprofits having a data breach. I'm going to give you some kind of practical tips, at least in the checklist I provide, but that's a real important thing, and it requires you to have certain provisions now with these providers like GDPR does. And then securely destroying private information within a reasonable time after it's no longer needed. Every organization should have what I call a data retention and destruction policy. Most organizations, like most people, keep things much longer than they need, right? If you walked into my basement, you'd wonder why I still have like my daughter's baby clothes sitting there. We don't throw things out. And at least with digital data, the longer you hold on to things you don't need, the more risk there is, the more penalties there can be. So I know organizations hate to kind of get rid of data. It's a bit of a task, but again, the more you get rid of when you don't need it, the better it is. So have a data retention and destruction policy. It kind of tells your organization how long to keep data, when to get rid of it. Again, if you don't have one, I can give you a kind of a checklist of things to consider and then help you work through it. Next slide.
Great. And I think I saw someone maybe raise their hand. Just a reminder, if you do have a question, if you can type that into the Q&A portion on your control panel now, and we'll go ahead and read those out loud. So if you could do that, if you have a question. Go ahead, John.
Great. So again, a lot of work I do with clients is what we call a data audit. It's kind of a great thing to do once every couple of years. If you're like most organizations I work with, you've never done one, that's fine. But it's a good thing to kind of put on the list, kind of maybe over the coming year. What a data audit is typically, what I do is give an organization, a couple hundred questions that everybody answers. And it kind of tells us what the strengths and weaknesses, where the gaps are in terms of your data privacy and cybersecurity approach. This is kind of a simple, like one-page tool, kind of encapsulate what a data audit does. And if you remember, like the 5 W's for journalism and the H that at least I learned when you're trying to do a story. So what? If you can answer all these questions, it's great, and it really is the first step to kind of having a smart data cybersecurity policy. So what data is your organization collecting? Just have a handle what it is, where it's coming from, why is that data being collected? Most organizations that I work with collect more data than they need, right? So only collect that personal information, that sensitive information that you need to run a transaction, to communicate with people, to market. Anything extra is again liability. Who has access to the data? Again, only people who have a need to have access to the data should have it. The more people, the more limits you have on that, the less risk of a breach. Where is the data stored? You should know what vendors have it. Is it offline? Is it on people's computers? And sorry, you may hear a dog barking in the background. That's what happens from working from home. So where the data is stored, that's a real important question to be able to answer and get your hands around. When is the data deleted? We talked about that before. You should not be keeping data forever. And then how, this is probably one of the most important ones, how is the data being protected? You really need, and the New York Shield Act requires it, GDPR requires it, that you're now responsible to making sure the data is being protected in kind of the appropriate way.
Great, John. We did have a question come in, so I'll go ahead and read that out to you. It says, John, if an organization does not have an employee who has a background in data security and can take the lead on coordinating a data security program, what do you recommend for that?
Yeah, you could work both with your IT person, if you have a head IT person, and maybe your, an attorney who knows some of this stuff. If he doesn't know some of this stuff, working with your IT people can get you there. For some of our clients, the small to mid-sized clients who may not have a dedicated resource, again, I serve that as that person. And it's not as complicated as it sounds, but it's just somebody kind of taking the lead to make sure things are being done the correct way. So again, if you don't have an internal resource, look at some of the external providers you're working with, send me an email. I can also kind of help put a program in place pretty quickly.
Great, thank you, John.
All right, so let's go to the next slide. So these are just a few things in terms of, we talked about the work from home. This is, goes even above and beyond that, and it's related to how to minimize your risk. And just having these few things in place can really go a long way, as I've seen with clients where things, there are missteps made. So first is review all third-party vendor agreements. I always tell this story. For a number of years, I was the Blackbaud at my company. I was the senior deputy general counsel there. And I did obviously a lot of work on their behalf on both the privacy side and the agreement side. And recently, the last number of years, I've been negotiating those agreements on behalf of our nonprofit clients. And about a couple of years ago, I was negotiating for a very large nonprofit, for a very large deal with Blackbaud, and we basically rewrote the agreement. We took their 8-page agreement and gave them a 20-page agreement. And the general counsel said to me, John, you wrote this agreement. Like, why are you changing it? It's, well, because I'm on the other side of the transaction. So the lesson here is the third-party data agreements, third-party vendor agreements tend to be very one-sided, right in favor of the vendor. No surprise, it's human nature, right? They're getting access to a lot of data and they want to kind of protect their interests. So what I noticed when I was at Blackbaud working with attorneys on the other side is people would often just look at the agreement, look at the language that was there, and just make changes to that. But it's not just what's in the agreement, it's what's not in the agreement. So again, most data breaches, if you're gonna have one, will probably come from a lapse of a third-party vendor. Negotiating key terms in these vendor agreements is key. They can all be negotiated. There are a number of key provisions you need to put in there, and putting in just a few key provisions can make a difference of you being on the hook for a data loss or the company being on the hook for data loss. So definitely review all key third-party agreements. If you haven't done so, when they come up for renewal, you need to pull them. The New York Shield Act requires that now. GDPR requires that now. Annually review and revise your online privacy policy in terms of use. I'm hoping you all have a privacy policy. If you have one, once a year it should be revised. And again, these other regulations require some specific terms. I always tell clients you can do almost anything you want with the data you collect from donors, as long as you're transparent about it. Say what you do what you say. If something happens and there's a breach and people go to your privacy policy, for example, I didn't know you were sharing my data with third parties. I didn't know you were doing list sharing. All that stuff is fine, but when you don't disclose it and there's a loss, that's where trouble begins. And talk about loss of donor trust. So you need to make sure your privacy policy is updated annually and kind of fits what you're doing. If you don't have a terms of use that protects the organization, you have one of those as well. Cybersecurity policy insurance, very important. They're not all created equal. You need to make sure you have one in case there's a loss. It covers for many things. I'll give you another anecdote. I was working with a client who was spending over $100,000 a year in a cybersecurity policy, very large nonprofit. I read the policy, it would not cover them. It was as if they were a service provider and not an organization using service providers. So these policies are important, but you also need to read them and make sure the exclusions make sense, make sure it fits what your organization needs. So if you don't have one, get one. If you have one, read it. And then we talked about implementing a data retention and destruction policy. Key. And if you don't have one, definitely should put that on the list.
Great. Another quick question for you, John, that came in. It says, John, you suggest a review of all third-party agreements. What specifically should organizations be looking for or focusing on?
Yeah, great question. I say 4 or 5 things that should be in every vendor agreement where people are getting access to PII, personally identifiable information. First of all, limitation liability. Almost every organization, vendor and Blackbaud, for example, gives you, if there's any kind of loss for anything, they limit your recovery to 6 months of fees. That's just inadequate. You need to have carve-outs to that. Every vendor will agree to carve-outs. You need to carve out for intentional acts, willful misconduct, IP infringement. You need to have a carve-out for data breach. If the vendor fails to follow their own protocols or fails to be commercially reasonable, and there's a data loss, that needs to be carved out. You need to be fully covered. Under the law, if there's a breach, your vendor is only required to contact you. You are required by law to contact all of your donors that have suffered from the breach. You may also be required to pay for data credit monitoring, regulatory costs, and a variety of other things. So you need to make sure that's carved out. Along with that, I have a specific provision I put in every agreement. I say I've never had a vendor say no to it in the end. They may have say no to it in the beginning, but definitely have a breach response and coverage section. Basically, if there's a breach, they have to notify you immediately what they need to do to kind of minimize that risk, and the fact that they have to pay for everything associated with that loss. Key provision needs to be in every agreement. The other thing is transition services. I find a lot of organizations have trouble leaving vendors because it's too hard to go from one vendor to the other. In every agreement you should have a 6-month transition requirement that requires vendors to work with you and your new vendor for a 6-month period for the same fees they were paying. And the last one I would add is, listen, during what I call the honeymoon phase, when you're looking at vendors, they're telling you everything about how great their system is, and they're giving you great marketing materials and all the features and functionality, everything sounds great. When you get to the agreement, I guarantee you there'll be none of those features and functionality, none of those marketing materials, nothing included in that agreement. And I've helped a number of clients try to negotiate a deal with the service provider, because the service provider says, well, we didn't promise these features and functionality. The hardest thing is to be able to kind of prove that. So one easy tip, whatever you get during this kind of sales phase from a company, attach it to the agreement. Make sure the agreement references that all these features, functionalities attached here, Exhibit A, are company represents and warrants that they'll provide that. If they don't, now you have a very easy access, very clear way to kind of challenge that organization, claim breach, and kind of get reparations. So that would be a few tips that should be in every agreement.
Great, that was awesome, John. Thank you. I'll go ahead and move to the next slide for you now.
Yeah. So let's talk about quickly HR things you should think about. And again, some of these are would have been great if you had a couple months ago. Maybe you do. If not, there's still things you can kind of think about. Prepare written communications to employees. This is about the steps you maybe had taken to kind of protect them from COVID-19. But listen, at some point, people are going to be coming back to the office. This kind of communication, all right, if you're coming back, here's what we're doing, here's what we're expecting. It's still an important thing to document. If you don't have it, prepare an infectious disease prepare plan, response plan. Again, it's not too late because we're going to be dealing with this for a while. We talked about a written business continuity, contingency, emergency plan, a good thing in general to have in place for anything like a pandemic or anything else. And then this is a key: review an employee remote work policy if you have one. If you don't have one, draft one. Listen, none of us, or many of us, are probably not rushing back to work, but even if we do, it could be staggered, right? A few days a week you're at home, a few days a week you're in the office. It could be in the fall, we may be forced to be home again for a while. So if you don't have one, an employee remote work policy is key. Again, they should know their expectations. They should know the do's and don'ts. It goes a long way to making sure people are doing the right things. And then finally, if you have obligations under various laws, ADA, Rehabilitation Act, FMLA, OSHA, workers' compensation, anything like that, now's the time to maybe start thinking about that, working with your employment attorney just to make sure you're covered. Okay. So just some insurance considerations to think about as we all kind of deal with COVID. You can go to the next slide. Your organization probably has a variety of insurance policies. Many of you may not have looked at them for a while. Any number of them could provide compensation or help during this time. Certainly there's employment liability with issues you have with employees, general liability, which can help with certain costs that you might be incurring. Event cancellation insurance, we're going to talk a little bit more about if you have to cancel an event, some ways to do that, but some people do have event cancellation insurance, and that goes a real long way. Workers' compensation for a variety of issues that can arise. And directors and officers liability, this is an important one. Fail to act appropriately. Again, let's hope this doesn't occur. But when we think about even getting people back to work, even what seems like it might have been a prudent decision to get people back to work early and somebody gets ill, it might not prevent them from still suing the company and the people who made that decision. So you should have that kind of insurance in place to protect the organization from claims that related to COVID-19 or anything else. Next slide, please. So key provisions too, when we talk about property and business interruption, like we've all had that probably. Property damage, likely you will have, it may cover damage from infection, believe it or not. We'll talk a little bit about that. Business income for loss of income. If your organization is facing loss of income, you may have coverage for that. Sometimes you have extra expense income, people working from home, you're providing laptops, you're creating a VPN, you're doing a variety of other things. You may have coverage for that. And extended business income, again, entitlement for longer coverage. Again, it depends on what your policies have. A great place to start is, giving your agent a call and saying, is anything I have in place that would, give me some benefits for what's going on now. Just, this physical loss or damage, a lot of times when we think about damage, we think it's a physical damage. Loss of and damage to are not synonymous. Some policies expressly define damage to include loss of use. So when I bring this up, meaning loss of office space, loss of other things that you're not able to kind of access or use. Some policies will actually cover that loss. You need to look specifically at your policy, but again, it's something to keep in mind. Key provisions, virus provisions, again, it's often called microorganism clause. A lot of policies have them, some don't, but you'll see here's an example. Some will have an exclusion, will not pay for loss or damage caused by or resulting from a virus, bacterium, or other microorganism. Some have that, some don't, but so it's something to kind of look at your policy and see how it's drafted. Next slide. One thing to keep in mind, I've talked to a few people and we've seen this, that some people have had coverage, virus protection coverage, and new policies that are coming out for this year now excluded. Let me go to the next slide there. So just look at the new policy that you have, make sure that you might have had a virus protection before and now you don't, which means you should say, no, I want the same policy. So tips for maximizing insurance coverage, if you have something, again, review your policies, get with your agent, see what you have, see if anything is covered. If you do have coverage, timely notice of a claim is really, really key. Almost every policy will have a time limit, right? The clock starts ticking once you have a loss. You could actually have a loss, have a claim, but you failed to give proper notice, and you're not going to get any claim back, any money on that claim. Document and quantify the claim. Make sure, again, keep good records. Call any conversations you have over the phone, detail them in writing, document them in writing. Denials. This is kind of a sad fact, but often most claims are denied. That's because insurance companies have found out that 100%, if they deny 100%, maybe only 10% of people come back. They may have paid on 50%, but their initial reaction is deny. Your initial reaction should be to fight. So look at that denial, work with your attorney, work with your insurance agent, your broker, if he's on your side. And in most cases, if it doesn't make sense, challenge the denial. Appraisal rights, if an insurance company offers you something you think it's unfair, most policies will allow you to ask for appraisal rights. You have a third party come in and basically document what the loss was. And again, we talk about consider time limits. You may have to react and provide documents in a certain period of time. Make sure you kind of meet those guidelines. So events, cancellation, termination. I just helped one of our larger clients who was having an international event in mid-June. This was about a month and a half ago, cancel the event. If you haven't this is kind of like third-party vendor agreements. If you don't negotiate your event agreements, they tend to be very one-sided and probably favor the event organizer. Depending on the type of contract you have, if you don't have an out, there may be a variety of other ways you can try to get out of the agreement. So I'll just give you a few things you can kind of consider to get out of event if you have one coming up. Okay. My first tip would be call the event organizer, call the person you're working with, and try to work through it, in an amicable way. We're all kind of going through this, and I find these days that vendors, everyone seems to be a little nicer, a little more forgiving. So you may be able to just work something out amicably without having to, involve attorneys and bad words and all that kind of stuff. Next one. So there are a number of ways you can get out of an event agreement if your contract doesn't allow it. One is force majeure. If we go to the next slide, because each one is kind of handled. Force majeure is a term that's in almost every agreement, and it's basically if one party is not able to perform because something happens. Typically there's language like acts of war, civil disorder, disaster, typically not pandemic, but pandemic would be considered a force majeure event. I'm now putting in my force majeure clauses, pandemic, but certainly an act of God, all these things basically would cover the spirit. The pandemic would be kind of covered by the spirit of what this language says. So if you have a force majeure section in your agreement, this might give you the ability to get out of that event agreement or other agreement where you have to perform because you simply can't, or it's unwise given the pandemic. Okay. And then another one is impossibility. This is a common law principle, meaning it's not kind of statutory, but it's a principle that kind of goes without saying, but let's say it. Impossibility is a principle that if it's impossible for you to perform, then you're forgiven for non-performance. And certainly when you go through COVID-19, they talk about the foreseeability of what factors to consider. Was the event foreseeable? No, obviously it wasn't. Is it the fault of the non-performing party? No, obviously it wasn't. So, given nothing else, you could probably get out of some of these agreements and commitments by claiming impossibility. Okay. And then insurance, again, consider all your policies. You may have, some of your policies may have kind of even business interruption, may allow you to get out of or get compensated for a loss for canceling an event or other type of relationship or engagement. So keep that in mind. Again, tip, just be proactive and timely. The sooner you jump on these things, even the sooner you try to get out of an event or give notice that you may have to terminate an event, the better, right? It goes to good faith and there may be contract implications. So yeah, just be proactive. And yeah, I mentioned this before, insurance, COVID-19, starting in January 2020, some insurers have started specifically excluding COVID-19. So read your policies when you get them. And again, we talked about this before, document all your claims. Okay, next one. Thank you. So final tips, I think I mentioned, privacy and cybersecurity, protecting your organizational data is really probably one of the most important things you can do. COVID-19 is obviously making that more challenging, but the requirements, the expectations, the legal ramifications, the PR ramifications are not going away just because, we're dealing with the pandemic, unfortunately. So, thinking about some of the things in terms of privacy that we talked about, cybersecurity, are really key. Organizations need to be prepared for the unknown of how long it's going to go for and if it comes back. So if you don't have some of those things we talked about putting in place, it's not too late. The pandemic is really raising the stakes for how we all kind of live and work. So it's challenging for all of us. We're all in the same boat. But hopefully, if you think about some of these concepts, it'll at least help to protect or at least minimize the risk that your organization might face today and going forward. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to open it up now to any questions that anybody has. If you didn't get the chance to ask something earlier and you wanted to ask it, if you do have a question, please submit it into the Q&A section on your control panel there. You can click on that and type your question in, and we will get those read out to John. We want to leave just a few minutes for that. That's the only way that we're going to be able to see your question and read it out. So please, if you do have any questions now, please go ahead and submit those, and we'll make sure that those get read.
And as I said, my email address is included on all this, so anybody can feel free to email me directly with a question. I'm happy to provide answers if I can.
Yes, definitely. If you have a question that you think of after the webinar and you didn't get the chance to ask it, please reach out to John directly. He'd definitely be happy to help you out. So while we're waiting to see if any questions come in, I did just want to let everyone know that we do hope you enjoyed the presentation today and that you join us for future events and webinars as well. You can find out about any of those by visiting us at jmtconsulting.com and clicking on the events tab. We are having no live events, obviously, in the upcoming future, but we do have plenty of webinars coming up, and most of those are free. So please go ahead and check those out. John, did you have anything else to add for us while we're waiting for any more questions to come in?
No, this has been great. No, I'm glad to, have the opportunity. The one observation I'll make is, over the years, I work with both for-profit and nonprofit organizations. And for whatever the reason, nonprofits has always seemed a few years behind, for-profits in terms of taking privacy and cybersecurity concerns putting at the forefront, making like what they call a C-suite concern. So, all these tips, and if we provide the checklist, things going forward that they can do, which is again, make them better stewards of the information they collect on behalf of their donors.
Great, thanks. And we actually did have a really good question just come in, John. It asks, if your policy has the virus and bacteria exclusion, should you file a potential claim anyway?
Yeah, I'd have to see the policy. If it has one, it depends on how it's drafted. You can try it. It makes it a little bit more of an uphill battle. It never hurts to try. But my suggestion would be going forward is, again, this is why people don't like to do it. I read policies on behalf of my clients. It's kind of like not a fun task. But not all policies are created equal. What I would have said is, if I had seen that, I would have said, let's take that out. And if your carrier would have said no, I would have said, let's find another carrier. Right? All carriers aren't created equal. There's a lot out there. Some offer this, some don't. So you can try and have to kind of look at the whole policy to really advise or work with whoever you're working with. But going forward, this is a great lesson for why it's important to actually read the policies and make sure you have one that's tailored to the organization.
Great answer, John. Another question that we had come in asks, have you seen failure to perform issues with carrying or caging vendors who may have been impacted due to COVID? How are nonprofits handling this type of operational challenge?
I have not seen that yet. I'm sure it's maybe some of our clients have and they haven't reached out yet, but that's, it's kind of a more general question for any of the vendors. And I think I mentioned before, you have a lot of nonprofits have a lot of mission critical vendors. Now's the time to assess, are they the right vendors? Make sure they have the right things in place to support your work going forward. These are still questions you can be asking. And then going forward, also looking at those agreements. If those things do happen, if people don't perform, what are your right to remedies? If you're like some of my clients, you just sign these vendor agreements, then something goes wrong, once in a while, you look at the agreement, you realize, wow, I'm really not covered. So I would say 95% of relationships go swimmingly well. There's never an issue. It's the few percent when things go wrong and everyone pulls out the contract. You're like, oh, damn, really wish I had maybe negotiated this differently. So that's a really good question. You'll have to wait and see what happens. And again, I'm sure either whoever you work with can advise, or I'm happy to advise as well, should it become an issue.
Definitely. We're having a lot of good questions come in. This one asks, is there any good insurance companies that you recommend? And if so, what are they? Thank you.
Good question. No, honestly, I don't, there's a number out there. I say I do work with a good agent who specializes in working with a lot of nonprofits. And he can look at a variety of different, I would not work, so for example, I just wouldn't call Chubb directly. I would work with a broker who has access to many different companies, and then based upon your needs can provide you a specific policy. So again, if you reach out to me, I'm happy to connect you with this person. You work with them directly. And then ideally they, again, ask you what you need, look at your organization, look at the things that are happening, and then provide like kind of the best companies that would kind of give you what you need. So yeah, that would be my approach. Don't go to a specific insurance company, go to a broker who can advise.
Great. Thank you, John. That was really good advice. So it looks like that's all the questions that we have so far. We'll see if in these last minute or so, if any more come in. But John, I did just want to say thank you so much for being here today. You gave a lot of really good practical advice that will help a lot of our nonprofit organizations out. So we really want to thank you for being here and giving such a good presentation for all of us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, yes. And here, it's really important, this slide, this does have John's email address as well as the Perlman and Perlman website up here. So if you did have a question, again, that you think of after, or you want to reach out to John just to get some more of his awesome advice and want to work with him, then his email is down here. And we definitely do recommend you reaching out to him for any follow-up or questions that you may have. He'll give you some really good advice. So I think that looks like that's all the questions that we're going to have today, and we are getting pretty close to the top of the hour here. So I just wanted to thank you again, John, for being here, giving us awesome advice. And we really just want to wish everyone a great rest of the day. We do hope everyone is staying safe and staying healthy, enjoying this time at home and with your families as much as you can be. And we just hope that everyone has a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.